anyone may have. If anyone has a question, can you give your name and then put your question to Natalie?
Yeah, the name's Brian. I come over from Anglesey today. But the question I want to ask is, you hit on the issue of the mountain hares. The Scottish Parliament, they seem to be listening to what people are saying to a certain extent. Why is it the Westminster Parliament just blank everything completely? You know, if the Scottish Parliament can listen, surely Westminster Parliament can listen. It just appears that is it a money issue or is it political? You know, it's all ties together, but somehow in Scotland they have started to listen, so I'd just like to see what your reply would be.
Thank you very much. Natalie?
Well, this is where I come back to a single issue that underlies practically all the other politics in Britain, which is we do not, in Britain, have a democracy. Scotland has a pretty fair, decent approximation of a democracy. It's well down the road. They have a proportional representation parliament, and they don't have an unelected House of Lords. So we have huge numbers of MPs, and, you know, Jacob Rees-Mogg is probably just the most extreme example of people who are in safe seats, who once they're selected by their party, are there indefinitely. They don't have to listen to the public at all. We have a situation where 64% of people did not vote Tory, and yet the Tories now have 100% of power. So you might think that, electoral reform, actually making Britain a democracy, which it is not now, might seem a long way from campaigning to protect our Hen Harriers, but actually it isn't. Scotland is a democracy, and it's listening to the people. It's taking some steps, not enough, but some steps to protect Hen Harriers, to protect all sorts of other wildlife. Westminster, which is not a democracy, is not doing that. And there's a causal relationship between those two things. So political reform should be on the agenda of everybody here.
Thank you, Natalie. Anyone else that would like to speak to Natalie, please? Anyone with a question? I'd just like to say, yep, okay, Mark. Just before Mark comes, I'd just like to say there's a more hideous result of the killing of these hares on the moors in Scotland. They're making it nearly impossible for the golden eagle to survive, because the golden eagle feeds predominantly on white hares. I've seen that. I've filmed golden eagles. Now you know what they're going to do, the golden eagles? They're going to go and start taking lambs. Then you know what's going to happen. They're going to get shot.
Right. No. What is it? It's on. Just speak.
We have a Wildlife and Countryside Act, 1981. The fine, I think off the top of my head, is a couple of £1,000, with a prison sentence of up to 6 months. Do you think it's time that fine needs increasing? Yeah. Because it's pittance to any estate owner, landowner or gamekeeper who's on thousands, millions of pounds. It's pittance, and then with a prison sentence of up to 6 months. 1981, we're in 2017. I don't know what the procedure is. I don't want to be putting Natalie on the spot, but she'd probably help me out here. What the procedure would be to get that law revised. With the new Labour Party, we had a ban on fox hunting. Does it require a landslide for somebody like Labour to get in again and revise that law, change that law? And what was the other one? Scotland, with its vicarious liability law, and a licensing law. There are no such laws in England and Wales. But yet with the petition for the ban on driven grouse shooting, this was brought up during the debate, and they frowned upon it, and they were interested. But me personally, I'd have been quite happy with a vicarious liability law and a licensing law. Again, what's the procedure? How do we go about? Does it require somebody like Labour to get in with a general landslide? Over to you, Natalie.
Okay. Thanks, Mark.
Well, I think I'd certainly agree that it's hard to imagine a Tory government, and the minister would be able to take the regulations through to increase the penalties, and you have to bring through legislation for vicarious liability or for licensing. It's hard to imagine the Tories doing that. One of the problems, and you know where I'm coming from. Obviously, a Labour government is a much better shot, but you have to get Labour interested in the countryside. And, that's a challenge that everyone here can work on, to work on the Labour Party, to get them interested, engaged, involved and knowledgeable. In terms of the question about increasing the fine for individual actions, I don't think that's actually going to take you very far, because most of the people who will get charged are going to be gamekeepers. If you're looking at individual, fines will be in relation to their income anyway. So increasing the fine, increasing the penalty is not going to help you very much. And of course it's enormously difficult, as we've seen again and again, to actually bring a successful prosecution. However, I think with the vicarious liability and the licensing, there is real potential. I'm still calling for a ban, but those would both be steps forward. Because one of the things, and you can think of, I'm sure everyone here has seen the case studies of this, there's a video of a masked, heavily covered over man who shoots or disturbs a nest. And then the police say, well, we can't prosecute because it's impossible to identify that person. And under our legal system, that's probably perfectly fair and reasonable. But if you have vicarious liability, or particularly if you have licensing, that's going to be part of the evidence that will allow you to remove the licence, even if you can't prove who did it. So I think I wouldn't focus on trying to increase the penalties on an individual basis. I think the licensing and the vicarious liability, in Scotland there are the states that have lost their licences. And that has to be the most powerful deterrent you could possibly imagine, far more than the penalty of an individual who, if it's a young gamekeeper on £19,000 a year, he's not going to get some enormous fine. It just doesn't work that way. So I wouldn't focus, just politically speaking, on that individual penalties. I'd focus on the bigger issues. And, licensing and vicarious liabilities are steps towards. And if you start to, license what's happening up there and stop some of the worst abuses, the economics, even with what they're doing now, is pretty marginal. If you make it uneconomic, you stop it. And that's another way, politically speaking, in which we can make progress.
Do we require a landslide from somebody like SDP, Labour to...
Well, I think realistically, we have to get rid of the Tories. Now, the reality of the politics now is the numbers make it, with Scotland, make it extraordinarily difficult for Labour to have a landslide. Any political analysis will tell you that. So it's far more likely to be some sort of coalition, confidence and supply involving the SNP. But that would give you the framework. It's just getting rid of the Tories is the key.
On rural affairs, we couldn't join the environment.
Right, we've got to get on, ladies and gentlemen. Natalie, thank you so much. Can I invite Luke Steele, please, to take the podium?
Thanks. I just want to thank Terry for all the hard work he's put in. I know he's been working hours, weeks on end, months to get this together, and for everything he's been doing. We had a good chat last night about the amazing work, very dedicated work that he's been doing around Bowland to protect the wildlife, going up onto the moors, being threatened, being intimidated by very nasty people to protect the wildlife out there. And I've never heard such a passionate, dedicated story from anybody really who's prepared to go out and do that. So thank you to Terry. Now let's not shy away from the truth about what is happening on the grouse moors of this country. Let's not shy away from the fact that they are baited with traps, with snares, with poison, with gamekeepers with guns, ready to take out any single form of wildlife that gets in their way. Let's not shy away from the fact that birds of prey are being targeted deliberately into extinction by these vile people who want to see them wiped off the face of the earth so that they can pursue a blood sport. Let's not shy away from the fact that foxes are often left days, dehydrated, caught in snares, shot in the head, that badgers are killed and persecuted in their snares too. Let's not shy away from the fact that the weasels have their necks broken in the traps just because they go out and do what's natural and predate. All in the name of a so-called sport. All so people can go out and get their kicks from shooting 750,000 grouse on the moors of this country every year, which is barbaric and outdated in itself. This is something that should be consigned to the medieval age. This is not something that we can look with all honesty and say should be continuing in a civilized, decent society like ours. This is something that should be relegated to the past, along with slavery, along with the people who refused to give women the vote, along with the people who upheld apartheid. This is the era that the grouse shooting industry is living in. And this is why we need to make sure that grouse shooting is consigned to history forever, without any compromise. Now, I know that since the petition went to Parliament, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of debate amongst ourselves, amongst the grouse shooting industry. And have no doubt the grouse shooting industry rely on the secrecy. They rely on the fact that they think, because they're out in the middle of nowhere and nobody can see what's going on, that unless you go out looking for those traps, those snares, those nests, that nobody gets to come across and see the reality and the brutality of what's going on, that they can remain hidden and secret away from people. So it's down to each and every single one of us to go out there. Tell your mothers, your fathers, your sons, your daughters, your uncles, your aunts, your neighbours exactly what is happening in the trough of Bowland, exactly what is happening on the grouse moors of this country, and show them the brutality of what this sadistic, vile industry is prepared to do. Wipe our natural history off the face of this earth in the name of a so-called sport. And only when we remove this veil of secrecy will we manage to abolish grouse shooting. Now, in Parliament, we did well in getting this issue on the table. But let's be realistic, it was never going to deliver the ban that we wanted. It was a first step. It was a vital step. It was our way of showing that the people of this country, of the communities around the grouse moors themselves, care about these issues and that they want to see change happening. But now we've got to look to the future. There was a time in history when each of the political parties wouldn't back basic reforms. The reforms to get rid of slavery, the reforms to give women the vote, that they wouldn't back an end to apartheid. And that's the position our movement is at the moment. But the grouse shooting industry will say that we're silenced. We're not. We have passion. We have the good fight on our side. And we have the fact that we deeply care about what is going on these grouse moors to push us forward towards victory. And there will become a time in the near future when the political parties start getting on our side. There's no doubt about it, because what is happening on these grouse moors is fundamentally wrong and needs to be abolished without compromise. And one by one, the political parties will start getting on our side. But we are in very early days towards that, and we shouldn't shy away from that fact. But what we need to do next is that we need to look at the public-facing landowners, like United Utilities, who own the largest proportion of the grouse moors in this area, like Yorkshire Water, who own the largest proportion of grouse moors on the other side of the hills in Yorkshire, like the National Trust, who are betraying our natural heritage by letting those moors be burned, be persecuted, be ruled by people who want to kill the wildlife in the name of sport, and who own about half of the Peak District National Park grouse moor. People like Bradford Council, who are stuck in the past and think that they can make cheap bucks whilst the wildlife dies, crashes on their watch. We need to get these people to stop leasing land for grouse moors. We need to go out there and shame them. We need to turn up at their AGMs. We need to turn up at their meetings. We need to buy shares and encourage members as well to get on our side by telling them what's going on. And once those gates open, we will see one by one, Bradford Council, National Trust, United Utilities, Yorkshire Water, one by one, they will stop. Mark my words on that, because we're a movement that's not prepared to compromise, because wildlife and the natural heritage of this country is at stake. And there's no compromising when the odds are so big in that way. So thank you all. And I just want to say one last word. All that it takes for evil to succeed is for good people to do nothing. And you are good people, and you will not let this evil succeed. So thank you. So I believe it's a Q&A now, so feel free to fire away any questions. That's first. Go for it, come to the front.
Go on to the front. One brave soul.
Well, I'm Jeff Clark, I'm from the Warrington area. I'm going to use 4 words that might upset people now. Patterson, Truss, Leadsom, Gove. I apologise for the language. We've had 4 Secretaries of State for the Environment who could only be described as totally unqualified for the job. They don't take any relevance of the science at all. I've got a direct quote from somebody from Natural England. Natural England, of course, are the people that provide the scientific evidence on which much of our laws are based. And their phrase was, it's like we're behind glass and screaming and nobody can hear us. When you've got your body that's responsible for the science saying that, how on earth are we expected for our natural environment to be protected to the standard that we expect as a nation? Do you have any views on which way that we should be going in terms of getting qualified Secretaries of State for the environment?
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. It's a difficult one, I think. The very nature of politics, particularly the DEFRA role, is that you can stand there at a bus stop and more buses can come along than DEFRA leaders with things. And they can go as quickly as a bus comes and goes. And that's a well-known phrase. I think we need to start the snowball. We need to start the snowball, and we're starting it here. And all the other groups around the north of England and Scotland and around the country speaking up for wildlife and speaking up for these issues is getting that snowball going. I mean, we look at the Hunting Act, for example, where the Hunting Act has been met with an awful lot of opposition. We've hit the hunting and shooting industry because, let's be realistic, these people behind this industry are the same 2 faces of the same coin. These are the people that go out fox hunting one day, shooting grouse the next, then go out to Africa to shoot some lions. And it's a snowball, and they put all their efforts into fighting the Hunting Act. But we're still in a position where they could not tear the Act down. The Act stays in place, and that is symbolic in itself. And we all agree, I'm sure, that it needs strengthening. But they couldn't take it out. Now, if we can get in that same position with grouse shooting with things, and we can keep that snowball going, where this ever-declining minority of old hat people who go grouse shooting, who get in with the grouse shooting industry, there's not many people my age who go out grouse shooting or go on fox hunts. And I've been out to grouse shoots, and I've been out to fox hunts, I've been out to pheasant shoots with things opposing them. And I never, ever see young people out there. And I very much feel that with my generation, there is a tide that is turning against this. And I feel that in the distant future, the near future, within my lifetime, there will be fundamental change in that regard. And I think that's the thing we've got to focus on and keep that snowball and that momentum going and going and going so nobody can stand in our way and stop us, like with the Hunting Act, where we kept it in place despite all that opposition, all that money put behind getting it and tearing it to pieces, and we still got that piece of legislation despite pledge after pledge to get rid of it. And I think that's monumental in itself.
Can I just throw one word in there, which is one of the problems is there are so few people in Parliament with a scientific background. Many years ago, on an entirely unrelated matter, I testified just as a member of the public to the Science and Technology Committee. 11 members, one person with a science qualification on that committee of 11. So what you can do is, traditionally often scientists have thought, we don't do politics, we just do the science. And I was actually speaking to the International Environmental Communication Association, and my message to them was, you can't just say, we're just going to present the data and wait for the politicians to work it out. If you're doing the science, you've got to do the politics as well. And we need those scientists there in Westminster. It doesn't mean that you have to have, a decent DEFRA secretary doesn't necessarily have to have a science degree. An open mind would be a starting point. But more politicians with a science background. My first degree is agricultural science, so I've got that background, although I never practiced as a scientist. But if you're a scientist, if you've got a child, a young person who's getting into science, say to them they've got to do politics as well, because that's the only way we're going to protect our planet.
Thank you, Luke, and Natalie again. The next speaker on my list has sort of already spoken. Nick, would you like to speak again?
Not really, Terry. No, I don't come to speak. I haven't got a script. I don't know how to. I'll just say a few words about.
We're not looking for Nicola.
Not looking for Nicola. I work in a beautiful fake village in Lower Wharfdale, and I hadn't set foot in Yorkshire before I started working in that village 13 years ago. And the first thing I noticed were the red kites, the raptors over my head, these beautiful, stunning birds. And that's what inspired me to find a little cottage in a place where I thought I might see more raptors. That's how ignorant I was. I'm not a politician, I've got no campaigning experience like Luke, and I'm not a scientist. But it's people like me that you're going to need to have to show these birds to get involved, because the realisation that those birds can get no further than Harrogate before they're slaughtered. One of them slaughtered the other day very close to Beefy Botham Shoot in near wherever that is.
Ripon.
Yeah, Ripon, that's the one, thank you. Just shortly before he went on the radio and took offence at being asked questions about shooting. It beggars belief, really. But yeah, the realisation that those birds should be on the moors which I inhabit now and which I've fallen in love with, and they're just not there. None of them are there. And I just think that what you've got to do is take people like me to places like that of beauty and show them what they're missing. Because it's criminal. We know it's criminal. The crime's going on. It's a few powerful people doing it, and we have to stop it because nobody else is going to do it for us. That's all I have to say.
Spoken from the heart. Right, next, somebody that has done me a lot of favours in the past. I regard him as a friend. Brian Etheridge.
Good morning, everyone.
Brian.
Right, well, I'm used to not using the mic, but anyhow, I use one. So I'm not a politician, I'm not a scientist. I'm a raptor lover, and I love Hen Harriers. Up your mouth. Mouth?
That's it.
You can hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. So bear with me, I've got a couple of props.
Anyone wants a picture, you can come and take one. It's the only Harrier you'll see.
Okay. So let me introduce you to Hen Harriers, because the way things are, this is how you will see them in the future, as stuffed mounts. So I'll give you a background of my work on this species. I saw my first hen harrier when I was 15 in the Kielder Forest. That was a long time ago. It's just amazing that there's still a few pairs there now, something like 50 odd years later. I started looking at hen harriers back in the 1970s. I was living in the north of Scotland, and there on the moors around where I was living, hen harriers were fairly regular. I got in touch with the RSPB at their local office, and eventually the job became vacant, which I applied for, which was organising a national survey. And that was back in 1988. And from 1988 through to 1990, I organised a national survey in Scotland. And we found something like 550 pairs of breeding hen harriers in Scotland. But we identified a major problem, and that was those pairs that were nesting on grouse moors had a very poor success rate. Right, yeah, my sentiments. Brilliant, been heckled by a bird of prey. I've lost my thread now. And so RSPB at the time were very concerned, and it led to conservation science looking in more details about this persecution. And that led me on to another 6 years studying the impacts of grouse moor management on the breeding success and the survival of hen harriers. And that was reported finally in 1997. So I've got some facts and figures that came out of that study, which are probably still very relevant today. So bear with me whilst I dig out my notes. And of course my spectacles, because otherwise I won't be able to read. So in this long-term 8-year study, we monitored 1,460 hen harrier nests, which may seem a phenomenal number, but this was spread over 8 years, so a sample of about 200 nests per year. 600 of these, something like 40%, were on grouse moors. So in those days, this is back again in the early 1990s, quite a high proportion of them were breeding on grouse moors. Grouse moors back then, 25 years ago, were not the grouse moors we have today. They were not the intensive moors with a mosaic of hill tracks they have now. And on top of that, gamekeepers did not have the mobility. Most of the gamekeepers, all they had was a beat-up old Land Rover. They didn't have quad bikes. They didn't have four-wheel drive. And so they did everything on foot. So often, way out on the edge of the moor, hen harriers were successfully breeding, or attempt to breed anyhow. And a big part of the study was marking the young birds that fledged with wing tags so that we could follow their fortunes. These were all individually marked, and so we marked 1,640, and we had over 900 sightings. And it was on the basis of the analysis of these sightings that allowed us to make some prediction what was happening to the population. So we found that nest success on grouse moors was only half that of pairs nesting not on grouse moors. The annual productivity of breeding pairs on grouse moors, they're producing on average about 0.8 chicks per breeding pair, compared to 2.4 on other moorlands. So it's only a third of their breeding success, only a third of the productivity as well. Also, that the annual survival of breeding females on grouse moors was only half that of females breeding on other moorland. And the analysis that we did showed that in most cases where the nest failed, also the female in charge of that nest also disappeared. It was never seen again. So at the time we estimated that 15% of the breeding females every year in Scotland were being killed on grouse moors. So the impact of all this was that grouse moors were a sink habitat. So they were drawing in hen harriers from other more productive areas, mainly in the West Highlands, where there were no grouse moors, and they were being drawn into these grouse moors every spring and then being killed, and then following year new birds were being drawn in. So there was a sink habitat. And so we estimated then that the population in Scotland was on the brink. So more or less the productivity and the illegal persecution more or less matched each other, and the bird species the population was on the brink. It could go either way. So any increase in the persecution could send the population into decline, or any reduction could cause it to increase. And we also estimated that without the persecution, that the population would increase at 13% per annum until a new sort of equilibrium would have been found, you know. So that was 25 years ago. So what we've had since then, we've had Langham 1, which was the very first study, which occurred more or less at the same time as I was doing my study. They found that at Langham, if you allow hen harrier populations, if you allow them to go breed unmolested, then you won't get driven grouse. That you won't get the surplus you need to have a driven grouse moor. So that was at Langham, and this result led to a very intense level of persecution, which really came in the late 1990s. A big change came. Suddenly, grouse moors that had one or two pairs and probably tolerated one or two pairs in the past suddenly decided they didn't want harriers and they wanted more grouse. And so, more or less in the late 1980s and right through the 20s, we've had this really new level of persecution. And it's more or less what we predicted, and the population has gone into decline. And the survey that we had last year, 2016, showed that the population in Scotland now has dropped to 420 pairs from the 550 that there was in the previous survey. So harriers are on a slippery slope. So I can only speak about Scotland. I was brought up in the north of England. It appalls me to think what's happening down in England. It would be completely intolerable to me for what's happening down here. I just don't think I think I would be up there with my banners walking these hill tracks, and facing the gamekeepers. I just couldn't stand it. It breaks my heart to think what you guys have got to put up with down here. However, the other side of, there's been several other things that have been done recently. You may have heard about a few things. One of the ideas put forward is that if you provide supplementary food at a hen harrier nest, then you can reduce the predation of grouse chicks to zero. So this has been, again, one of the findings that they discovered at Langham. Hen harriers will take carrion if it's provided freshly, and if you provide laboratory rats and day-old chicks, they will take them, and effectively it just stops the predation of grouse chicks. It cuts it down to virtually nil. So this initiative has been promoted both by the RSPB and also by the grouse shooting industry. But it's been taken up by no estates at all. There are no estates, despite the fact there are government grants to pay for the purchase of these animals. They don't want it. To them, it's much easier to deal with what they see as a problem rather than what they see as increasing the problem. So the other, of course, proposal on the table, which we've all heard about, is probably what they say is the population ceiling scheme, whereby they will come up with an arbitrary figure of the number of pairs that will be tolerated on grouse moors. Before then there would be intervention, which would be removing those surplus pairs and releasing them further south in England and rearing them in captivity and releasing them elsewhere. So at the moment this is still up in the air. At the moment I can't see it ever coming to fruition, even if we agreed to the basic principle of a ceiling, because at the moment, where in England would that work? There are no estates no grouse moor estates with any breeding hen harriers. So even if we say yes, ceiling would be a good idea, we will accept 1 pair per 2,000 hectares, for example. I don't think there'll be one estate step forward and say, right, we'll go in with this, we've got 2 pairs, can you remove one of them? I just don't think, because I think at the moment with driven grouse moors, they just want it their way. They're not prepared to compromise 1 inch. They're not going to come our way 1 inch at all. Nothing's going to change. And so certainly for the last 20 years, I've accepted that driven grouse and hen harriers are not compatible. If you want hen harriers, you're opposed to driven grouse. You can't have them both. I've got some other little facts here. I'm not really political, but I've become rather political in time, just through frustration. It annoys me to hell to think that a grouse moor owner gains considerable sums from the public purse, something like over £50 per hectare under the Common Agricultural Policy. There are something like 285,000 hectares of grouse moors in England. So I'll let you do the sums of the amount of money that's now flooding into those. So we, the taxpayers, we're paying for grouse moors. All of you. If you pay tax, you pay for grouse moors. It may be only a few pennies, but you're all contributing to it.
We don't pay for them to kill them, though. Kill their now, the birds of prey.
Currently, the number of people involved in grouse shooting in this country is estimated to be something like 8 people for every 10,000 people there are. That's 8 people for every 10,000. So it is a very much a minority interest, but it's having a major impact on birds, on pollution. The moors are just so degraded. So the argument now, we should take it further, and I've been listening to our previous speakers. And the question we all should be saying, and what we want Parliament to ask is this a legitimate and a sustainable, useful land in the 21st century? Well, I would say no, it's not. What services does it provide for the public? None whatsoever. It gives you a hill track to walk along, but providing you don't step off onto the moor. And the only way I can see, and I'm quite glad I live in Scotland, is if they're not prepared to get rid of driven grouse moors, then we want some form of government registration for all forms of shooting, for forms of game shooting. And that's certainly being discussed now and being investigated by the Scottish Parliament. But I wish I could say the same for down here in England. So I've rambled on a bit. I'm very passionate about hen harriers, and I invite all of you to come to Scotland, because we do have Hen Harriers, and I invite any of you to get in contact with me during the summer months. If you want to see Hen Harriers, I'm prepared to show you that. So that extends to you all, providing you only come in pairs. I couldn't deal with a lot of you. You may be interested in where these two birds came from. These two were among a pile of birds of prey confiscated from an illegal bird stuffer something like 25 years ago. The label you can see is the police evidence label, still attached to the leg of this male Hen Harrier. The person who was doing the stuffing was in the game feed industry. He was supplying game food to gamekeepers, and they were supplying him with dead birds of prey. He was then stuffing them, passing them back to the gamekeepers, and they were then selling them to the clients. So this was 25 years ago. He was fined £2,400. So I got the collection that were confiscated: pair of Hen Harriers, pair of Merlins, pair of Peregrines, pair of Buzzards, pair of Tawny Owls, pair of Short-eared Owls. They're all sitting on my mantelpiece. Okay. Oh dear. Yeah, that's it. Another one bites the dust. Okay, I think I've rattled on a bit long enough. Thanks very much.
Anyone any questions for Ryan? Anyone at all? At least one question.
No question.
Can we have your name, sir?
Yeah, hi. Could you answer the question? What about the argument that's put forward that grouse shooting is vital to the countryside, the economy of the countryside?
Thanks.
That's not going to take long to answer.
It's vital. It might be. From their point of view, it may be vital, because at the moment that's the only thing they've got going. You know, so it supports gamekeepers, their wives. It supports a few shops. You know, but and during this very short shooting season, it supports the shooters who come in. But it doesn't support people all the year round. But wildlife does. And if you could take people up onto the moors in parties and show them Hen Harriers, you could show them birds of prey, you can just show them a natural system, not burnt heather, eroded hillsides. If you can show them that, you could do that 12 months of the year.
Yeah.
So I think the argument is flawed, very flawed.
Important announcement, ladies and gentlemen. Keep it quiet. Duncan Thomas has just driven past. Yeah. Any more questions for Brian? What's your name?
Sorry, my name's Brian.
Hi, Brian.
Like everybody else, I'm just absolutely gobsmacked that our national parks are there for the enjoyment of everybody, walkers, hikers, bird watchers. How gamekeepers get away with breaking the law when they're publicly owned, I find that beyond belief. I went to the North Yorkshire Moors last year. I spent a week bird watching. I see 2 birds of prey in a week. I stayed in a cottage. Local farmer come out to me at the end of the week. He said, "Now lad, you see any birds?" I says, 2 birds of prey. They see, "They'll see now lad. Anything with a talon or a beak, shot." Quite openly, matter of fact. And yet these are our national parks. Surely we should be able to put pressure on them to say, you should not allow this to happen. Maybe relax the planning laws and said, well, we'll throw a couple of council estates on if you don't stop and do something. You know, surely that's where we could weigh into them and say, we're not prepared to accept it anymore. See what you think.
We have national parks in Scotland, and so our nearest one is the Cairngorm National Park, and they've got a national park authority that more or less governs it, what goes on within the national park. But also quite a number of the estates are grouse moors within the national park, and so for certainly the last 20 years there's been no breeding Hen Harriers in the Cairngorm National Park until this year, when one major estate, which was purchased by a Danish gentleman who wants to turn the moor back to wild land again, and he has taken on the gamekeeping staff that were on the estate before, and now their job is just to control deer numbers. That's all they have to do. They're forbidden to kill anything else. They can't kill crows, they can't kill foxes. They just got to reduce the deer numbers so that the woodland can spread back. And this year there were 4 pairs of Hen Harriers bred on that moor. So it shows you the very rapid impact that can happen when a national park authority, you know, when you get just one landowner within a national park can change. And that doesn't have to happen within a national park. And so I would say the people to speak to is the National Park Authority, and ask them, you know, challenge them, go to their AGMs and find out why don't you have these iconic species? You should have them.
Someone else? Same point. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Brian.
Harry.
Oh, hang on. Oh, right. Ian West. Nice to meet you again, Ian. Ian worked for the RSPB until a few years ago.
Brian, what about the effect of lead shot? What's your views on that that's used by the shooting industry? Its impact on the environment and on public health, or potentially on public health?
Especially on United Utilities of property, which is a water catchment.
Yeah.
Well, I'm no expert on lead shot, but of course I do know it's highly toxic. And the fact that they've now restricted its use over wetlands, this is lakes, marshes, for wildfowling, mainly because the predation on these wildfowl that carry lead shot in them, predation by other animals causes them to suffer, particularly birds of prey. So they've more or less restricted the use of lead shot over wetlands, but to me, the uplands are wetlands as well. And they've been shooting these uplands for hundreds of years. There's tons and tons of lead shot leaching out, coming into your water, which we're all drinking. We've all got lead shot in us to varying amounts. Perhaps those who eat game birds have got considerably more lead shot in them than we have, which probably accounts for some of their reasoning when you try to talk to them.